The young and the restless spoilers Diane had spent years building a new life, one brick at a time, laying each moment carefully atop the ashes of her old sins. Her reunion with Jack had not been easy, nor was it universally accepted, but it had been real. And Kyle, her son, her redemption, he was finally back in her life, not just as a name she whispered in guilt but as a living presence who had, with time, begun to forgive. But all of that, the stability, the fragile trust, the reconfigured future, was now hanging by a thread. And that thread was held between the calculating fingers of Cane, a man once thought to be aimless and fading into the shadows of Genoa City's many power players, now re-emerging like a ghost with a vendetta and a sinister calm that chilled Diane to the core. She had not expected the message. The envelope was hand-delivered, no return address, the paper thick and scentless, but the thread inside was unmistakable. Cane knew. He knew everything, details only a very small circle had access to, and even fewer dared to speak aloud. He had named names, referenced dates, whispered secrets in ink that Diane thought had been buried with the past. He knew how fragile Jack's trust was, how explosive Kyle's resentment could become, and how the web of lies she had so carefully masked in motherhood and second chances could unravel with one sharp tug. She clutched the paper in trembling hands, reading and rereading the threat until the words blurred. If she didn't help Cane acquire Chancellor Abbott, he would expose her. Not just her past indiscretions, but the one secret she had sworn to take to the grave. The secret that could destroy the tenuous bond between Jack and Kyle. The secret that had always loomed in her mind like a thundercloud, but which she had desperately hoped would never rain down. And now, it was Cane who stood ready with the storm. She hadn't spoken to him in years, hadn't even considered him a threat. Yet now, somehow, he had reinvented himself, not as a passive schemer but as an active predator. He had come back to Genoa City not just to reclaim influence, but to dominate, to reshape the playing field, and he was starting by cornering the most emotionally volatile element, family. Jack, as usual, was blind to the subtleties of what was brewing. He had always trusted too easily when it came to family, especially Diane. He had chosen her over caution, believing in her transformation, in her redemption arc. He didn't see the way Diane had started locking her office door more often, the way she flinched at unexpected phone calls, or the way her eyes darted toward Kyle every time he entered a room, as though measuring the damage Cane's revelation might cause. Kyle himself had been preoccupied with his own demons, his fractured relationships, his bitterness toward Audra, and his unresolved feelings about Claire. He hadn't noticed the storm building beneath Diane's calm facade. But it was there, and it was eating her alive. Diane knew that Chancellor Abbott was more than a company, it was a symbol of Jack's legacy, of the unity he believed he'd forged between two of the city's most powerful families. For Cane to swoop in and lay claim to it would be a calculated humiliation, one that would not only wound Jack professionally but emotionally. And yet, she found herself backed into a corner. Cane hadn't asked for money, or favors, or a seat at the boardroom table. He wanted Diane's betrayal. He wanted her to walk into that house, smile at Jack, and stab him in the back without flinching. It wasn't about business. It was about control. And Diane realized then that Cane's obsession wasn't with profit, it was with punishment. The question that haunted her was simple: how did he know? Who had given him access to a secret she had safeguarded with every ounce of strength she had? There were only a handful of people who could have known. Could it have been Phyllis, always watching from the shadows, nursing her vendettas with surgical precision? Or perhaps someone from her past dealings, a discarded accomplice, a jilted confidant, someone she had underestimated? The not knowing was almost worse than the threat itself. It meant Diane couldn't trust anyone, couldn't lean on Jack or confide in Kyle, because any of them could have been the leak. That isolation, that creeping paranoia, was part of Cane's design. He wasn't just threatening to destroy her, he was forcing her to do it herself, piece by piece, decision by decision. And now she had to make the hardest one yet. Chancellor Abbott. Helping Cane acquire it would be a direct betrayal of everything Jack had worked to protect. But if she refused, Kyle might never forgive her for what would come next. Diane had imagined that reunion with Kyle so many times, his small steps toward forgiveness, his willingness to call her mom again. She couldn't bear to see that flame snuffed out. But aiding Cane would mean becoming again the woman she had spent years trying to forget. It meant silencing her own ethics, betraying Jack, risking it all for a temporary reprieve. She sat in her room late into the night, the documents Cane had sent spread out before her like the evidence of a trial she was both judge and defendant in. Every option came with a cost. Every move was a trap. She stared into the mirror and barely recognized herself. The woman in the glass wasn't a survivor, she was a hostage. A pawn in Cane's game, reduced to bargaining with ghosts. And for what? To keep Kyle from hating her? To protect Jack from the fallout of a truth he might have already suspected? The lines had blurred. Diane was no longer sure who she was protecting, or whether she was simply delaying the inevitable. But Cane knew. He knew her breaking point, and he was inching her closer to it with every passing day. His messages became more frequent, more specific. He referenced old journal entries, emails she thought deleted, whispered moments between her and Jack that should never have been known. And with each message, his price rose, not in money, but in submission. Cane had transformed. He was no longer the charming outsider, the underestimated schemer. He had reinvented himself as something colder, more calculating. Whatever had happened to him in his absence from Genoa City had twisted him. Maybe it was rejection. Maybe it was betrayal. Maybe it was the simple, corrosive power of knowing other people's secrets and realizing he could weaponize them. But he was back now, and he had made it clear, he wasn't leaving without taking something that mattered. And if that something was Jack's trust, Kyle's stability, or Diane's soul, so be it. Diane knew what she had to do. She met with a lawyer, under an alias, to explore what her options might be if the secret came out. She began transferring small assets into separate accounts, a contingency plan in case everything collapsed. She even drafted a letter to Jack and Kyle, confession or farewell, she wasn't sure, which she burned before she could send. But Cane was always one step ahead. He called her late one evening, his voice calm and venomous, reminding her that time was running out. He didn't need Chancellor Abbott immediately. But he needed progress. He needed her to speak the words, to promise betrayal. And in that moment, Diane broke. Her voice shook as she agreed. Not because she believed she could live with the consequences, but because she couldn't bear the uncertainty of silence any longer. And so it began. Diane, the reborn matriarch, walked into Jack's office the next morning and began her quiet undoing. She suggested a merger. She questioned the company's recent losses. She laid the groundwork for what would become the first step in Cane's plan. And all the while, her heart shattered beneath the weight of what she was doing. Kyle greeted her with a casual hug that nearly broke her spine. Jack smiled and kissed her temple, oblivious to the fracture she had just triggered in the floor beneath their feet. Diane smiled back, her expression unreadable, her soul already halfway to ruin. But this was just the beginning. Diane couldn't sleep. The walls of the Abbott estate seemed to close in tighter each night, and the house that once offered sanctuary now felt like a cathedral of guilt, echoing every breath with a whispered warning, time was running out. She had agreed to Cane's demands, but no part of her soul had accepted the betrayal she was being forced to enact. Her hands trembled each time she reached for her phone, waiting for the next message, the next threat, the next push down a slope she already couldn't climb back up. The weight of her decisions was growing unbearable, and each time she looked at Jack's trusting eyes or felt Kyle's arms wrap around her in casual gratitude, a scream began to rise inside her, muffled only by fear. The secret Cane held over her was not a simple sin. It was the kind of truth that detonated legacies, that fractured identities. If revealed, it wouldn't just destroy her, it would redefine the very foundation of Kyle's existence. Kyle, who had grown up believing he was Jack Abbott's son, who carried the Abbott name with pride and pain, who found his place in Genoa City through bloodlines and boardrooms, what would he become if that lineage were ripped away? Diane had fought so hard to regain a place in his life, to stitch together a relationship shredded by her past. But Cane could undo all of it with one press of a button, one public statement, one document released to the press or whispered in the wrong ear. And Kyle wouldn't be the only casualty. Jack's world would shatter. The Abbott name would be wounded. Enemies would feast. And Diane would not survive it. Yet somewhere deep inside her, a voice kept asking, what if you told them first? What if you didn't wait for Cane's blade, but handed the truth over yourself? There was an odd power in that idea, an audacious hope that honesty might save her, that vulnerability might be her final card. If she told Jack the truth, owned it fully, explained the circumstances, the shame, the regret, could he forgive her? Could Kyle? It was impossible to predict. Jack might rage. Kyle might walk away forever. But at least it would be her choice. At least she wouldn't be crawling to Cane anymore, trading pieces of her soul for silence. And yet, what if Jack didn't believe she'd kept it from him for the right reasons? What if he saw only the manipulation, the years of deception, and not the mother who had made the impossible choice to protect her child? Diane replayed that possibility again and again, pacing in the darkness, flinching each time the floor creaked underfoot. She imagined the confrontation. Jack's eyes narrowing, his voice rising, Kyle recoiling as if from something filthy. And each version of that scene ended the same way, with her alone, exiled, ruined. She had seen what Genoa City did to women who betrayed legacies. She had lived through that exile once before. She wasn't sure she could survive it again. That's when the third option began to take shape. Not as a conscious thought, but as a shadow that lingered longer than it should have, as a whisper she first dismissed, then entertained. What if Cane simply disappeared? It was absurd. Diane wasn't a killer. She didn't have the stomach or the connections to erase a man like Cane. He was too public now, too powerful. His return had not been subtle, he was throwing parties, forging alliances, building an empire out of Chancellor and whatever pieces of Newman he could pry loose. People were watching him. People were afraid of him. But people also made mistakes. He traveled. He trusted the wrong staff. He liked to gloat. She began to notice the patterns in his arrogance, how he underestimated her, how he saw her only as a pawn. She didn't know if she could kill him. But perhaps someone else could. Someone who owed her. Someone with a debt to settle or a taste for chaos. The idea of murder repulsed her. But the idea of losing Kyle, of destroying Jack, that terrified her more. Still, Diane wasn't reckless. She began collecting information, not as a killer, but as a mother cornered. She learned Cane's habits, his schedules, the people he spoke to regularly. She tapped into her old connections, not criminals, but shadows from her past who still moved through legal gray zones. She asked questions with plausible deniability, always careful, always vague. But the intent was there. Not a plan. Not yet. But a possibility. And she hated herself for it. Each night she stared at her reflection, searching for signs of the woman she had once become, the manipulative, ambitious schemer who would have done anything for control. She had buried that woman. She had raised herself from those ashes. But now she was digging her up, bone by bone, because the threat was too great. Meanwhile, Cane remained untouchable. He was methodical. He didn't push too hard, too fast. He gave Diane just enough time between demands to hope he'd forgotten, then reminded her, gently, cruelly, that he hadn't. His leverage wasn't just the secret, it was the timeline. He hinted that others might already know. That maybe he wasn't the only one with a copy of the DNA results. That maybe one day Kyle would receive an anonymous envelope, just like Diane had, and everything would implode anyway. It was psychological torture, perfectly executed. Diane was unraveling. And Cane knew it. What haunted Diane most was the mystery of the leak. Who had told Cane? She had guarded Kyle's true paternity for decades. The tests had been done discreetly, the documents buried under fake names and encrypted files. Only one or two people could have known, and both were either dead or far away. Unless Kyle had told someone, unknowingly. Unless there had been a breach long before she realized it. The uncertainty was maddening. She began questioning everything. Her phone. Her laptop. Her conversations. She wondered if she had been followed, if someone had been recording her without her knowledge. It wasn't paranoia. Not anymore. It was survival. And still, the question loomed, when would Cane strike? Would he do it during a board meeting, force Jack's hand in front of investors? Would he leak it to the press? Would he whisper it to Kyle over a drink, frame it as a concerned revelation? Or would he simply let Diane crumble under the pressure, watching her destroy herself before he ever needed to say a word? She didn't know. And that uncertainty was its own form of violence. Jack, as always, remained unaware. He continued to smile, to speak about the future, about plans for Chancellor Abbott, about strengthening the family legacy. And each time he did, Diane's heart shattered further. Because the legacy he spoke of was a lie. Kyle was not his son. Not by blood. Not by DNA. And one day soon, that truth would tear through their lives like a grenade. She considered telling Kyle first. Preparing him. But how do you tell someone their entire identity is a fabrication? That the man they have spent a lifetime emulating, resenting, loving, is not their father? That the blood in their veins ties them not to the Abbotts, but to someone else entirely, someone Diane still couldn't bring herself to name? Kyle had never handled betrayal well. He took everything personally, viscerally. He would see it not as protection, but as deception. And if Jack found out before Kyle, the damage would be irreversible. It had to be one or the other. Or none at all. So Diane made a decision. One last try. One last gamble. She would confront Cane not as a victim, but as an equal. She would demand to know who told him, how he found out, and what he truly wanted. Not just the company, not just power. What did he really want? Because the Cane she remembered was not this cruel. Something had broken in him. Something had transformed him into a man who trafficked in other people's destruction. If she could find that crack, whatever it was, maybe she could exploit it. Maybe she could save what little remained of her soul before it was too late. And if she couldn't? Then yes. She would kill him. Or die trying.